As a tiny bilingual child, Doris Smith loved to hear stories. As a grown-up, she still enjoys them, and she has found that people of all ages are willing listeners too. So she's now about to tell you a particular story. First, she'll portray her Swiss immigrant grandma Luscher. This will be followed by the grandmother's youngest daughter, Doris's mother. When Doris returns as herself, she'll bring the story up to the present time. During the dramatization, Doris will see interested faces, sympathetic expressions, knowing nods, and sometimes big smiles. So come, let's share in the interweaving of a part of the American tapestry.
Grüezi, ich bin Louise Luscher und ich bin von der Schweiz. Oh, excuse me, I am sorry. I made a mistake. I must talk in the English. I am Louise Luscher and I come from Switzerland. I am married to a baker, and we have 4 living daughters. One died soon after we came to America. The little village of Muttens by Basel, that means it was a little village named Muttens, and it was near a city named Basel. That village was a nice little place to live. We had hard times there, and sometimes we had some very nice times. I had to help Jacob or Jacob work in the bakery sometimes, and also in the room next to it where we had wedding receptions and parties like that. And sometimes then when I was doing that, I went and took the children over to my mother's house. And there she told them stories and she gave them cookies and milk. And they liked it there very much. On Sundays, we walked over to the St. Arbogast Church that was there a very long time ago from the Holy Roman Empire. It was a place that I loved very much. When Jacob decided that he was coming to America, he came and he said to me, Louise, I am going to sell the bakery, and then I am going to go over to that new United States, and I am going to get rich like everybody else. And I thought, what will happen to us? And I said that to Jacob, and he said, oh, your mother will let you come and live with her till I save the money. And so that is what we did. And he went over to Paterson, New Jersey, and he was meeting Swiss people over there, and he got some work. And then by and by, he went to Cincinnati, Ohio. And there he was living with some cousin. And he worked there. Then for some reason, he went back to Paterson. And there he was working and saving, and by, our 2 children, Louise and Sophie, finished the gymnasium. Now the gymnasium is something like the high school. And then he said, wrote in the letter, you come and you will be working in the Silk City of the United States. And they did. They worked in one of the big factories making the silk cloth, and they saved money. And after a while, maybe a couple of years, then I was able to come over to join the family with the other 3 girls. Now, it was very hard for me to leave because I was leaving my mother. My mother was in her 80s, and I knew that I would never see her again. So I did cry a lot. It was all right when we got on the train, and then we got on the boat that went over across the big ocean. It seemed like a time that would never end. But then, by and by, somebody shouted a lot, and then many people were shouting, and we came to a place that was called Ellis Island. And everybody was getting busy coming off of this boat, and we were all following each other, and all the peoples were talking languages that nobody understood each other, except the few that were together. And so I was walking along, and in front of me was the little shy Friedi and the blonde Marie, and my little Emmy was hanging on my skirt. She did not want to get lost. And I thought to myself, I have to make believe that I am not afraid. But I was afraid. I had a letter from Jakob, and in it he said, "Du musst nicht hinken." And I said to myself, I must remember, do not limp. And I was thinking how I would have liked to bring some things over, more things with me. But I had on my Ohrringli, and I was carrying my prayer book, and then at home I would have my coffee millie to grind the coffee. And that would make me feel like maybe I was still a little bit at home in Switzerland. So then we came along to the steps that we went up, and already we could see many people walked up these steps before us, because there was little things, not holes, I don't know what you call it, but you could see that the many people were walking on these steps. And we went up, and then we came along to people who were the inspectors, and they were standing and looking at us, and I thought to myself, they can look right inside of me. They know what I am thinking. I must be very careful. And so I was walking straight and tall, and I was not limping. And we came along past this lady, and she didn't say anything, and we just kept coming. And all of a sudden, I heard her say, "Louisa, Louisa." And I turned and looked at her, and she waved her hand. "Come back here, Louisa." And then when I got back there, when I was going back there, I was thinking, what did I do wrong? And then I remembered. I was so relieved to go past this lady that I forgot. And I limped. And she saw it, and she was calling me back. Oh, Jacob would be so angry with me.
Louise Luscher has just told us part of her story. Clearly, there is more that she will tell us in a personal presentation. How she becomes a legal immigrant is a very moving story. For now, we'll continue on with an introduction of Louise's daughter, Emma Luscher Smith. who will bring us part of her story.
Good morning. I'm Emma Luscher Smith, and I came from Switzerland when I was about 9 years old. My mother and my sisters and I came to Ellis Island when we first came to this country. Everything was going along very well until a woman came and took our mother away from us. And we were very afraid. We didn't know what was going to be happening to us. And a woman said, "Come with us, girls. You're going to be all right." And we were taken into a room. And after a while, she came along and she said, "Girls, it's time that you think that you ought to be going to sleep." And we looked at each other and said, "Schlofa? Sleep? How could we possibly sleep?" We were so anxious and worried about our mother and what was going to happen to us. We were so afraid we didn't even take off our hats. Can you imagine that? Those were those straw hats that had the shallow crowns and the wide brims. And we fell asleep with those on. In the morning, a woman came in and said, "Okay, everybody, come on." And so we followed. We went down through a line of people into a room that was large with long tables and benches alongside of them. And when the people in front of us sat, we sat. And I looked across the table at me and I saw two women with babushkas on, and I said to myself, I never saw people wearing those things. And then one of the women reached across into the middle of the table, grabbed a block of butter. Was it cheese? I don't know. She broke it in half, thrust one half to her companion, and the two of them began eating on this as though they had never had anything to eat before and maybe wouldn't again. And it really left me wondering, what should I do? And then we could see people helping themselves from the dishes on the table, and my sisters and I said to each other, "What's all we're doing? What shall we do?" And a woman who was sitting nearby heard us, and she spoke German, not the same as we did, but enough so she could say, "Mädchen, help yourselves. You must eat." And you know, once we had a little food in our bellies, we did feel better. And it was later on, a couple of days later, we found that we hadn't been able to leave Ellis Island right away because of our mother's legs. They had ulcers on them from, I think probably it was phlebitis. And in those days, you know, they couldn't take care of it the way they would be able to today. When I got out of school, I got a job in a department store. That would have been something like Kaufmann's or maybe Penny's, and I liked it very much. And that is where I met my husband. His name was Doris Smith, and he was in the receiving department, and by we got married. And we lived about a block away from my parents, and after a couple of years we had a little girl named Doris, and she used to go over to my mother's, to the bakery, and my sister Louise and my mother took care of her while I was back working in the department store. And she had many good, happy memories from being there. After a while, I had another daughter named Marjorie, and then one named Joan. And then time kept going along, and my husband was a motorman on a trolley car. And after a while, they took the trolleys off the track and they went over to buses. The problem with that was that they had more bus drivers now than they needed. And George became one of the ones that they laid off. This was especially difficult because it was in the midst of the Great Depression. He looked and looked and looked for a job, and he just couldn't find anything. So one day someone he knew said, "Hey George, I hear that they're looking for laundry truck drivers up at Little Falls Laundry because of the big strike that's going on." So George went up and he looked, and by the time he got there, all the men had been hired. But the man with whom he was talking said, "You're married, right? You have a wife? Send her. I sure can use her." And so George came home and said to me, "Hey, Em, got a job for you. You're going to have to go to work." And I had no choice. I didn't want to go, but that's what you do when you're really in really dire straits. So I went up there, and I was very afraid because there had been violence and the National Guard was out to keep order. And I was really very afraid that my red hair was going to attract them. And so I was talking to Doris, my 12-year-old daughter, and I was saying to her, "I don't know what I'm going to do." And I suppose, after all, it was foolish for me to express how I felt to a 12-year-old, because she gave me a 12-year-old answer. She said, "Oh, Mother, you think your hair is so red that everybody looks at you all the time. You're going to be safe. Those soldiers are there to guard you." And I said, "Yes, but what if I go to downtown Patterson and one of those people remembers me?" And she said, "Stop worrying about it. You're always worrying, Mother." And so I went to work there.
And so we have heard part of Emma Luscher Smith's story. When you hear her remarks of the anxieties of her first days at Ellis Island, you will perhaps think of your own family's arrival in this country. When you see the whole presentation, you'll also learn about some of her life after starting her job in Little Falls Laundry in 1936. Let's turn now to Doris Smith Naundorf, the grandchild of Louise Luscher, who has written this three-person account of coming to America.
Hi, I'm Doris Louise Smith Naundorf, and I came here today with my grandmother and my mother because we symbolize 3 generations of women during this century. My grandmother was the immigrant from Europe. My mother, also an immigrant as a child, then was a deep depression wife. And I guess you could say that I was a post-World War II young bride. And I have to tell you about my life with my beloved Grandma Luscher. She just was such a nice lady. She would tell me stories without end, and all these stories always had a little girl in them. I remember when I think that she'd never tired of telling me stories, I remember very clearly one day when I said, "Grandma, vertel mir een geschichtli." And she rolled her eyes and sighed and thought, oh, tell her a story again. Does she never tire of that? And I think that I never tired of it because now here I am telling a story. I went as a child to the same grade school that my mother went to. Most of the teachers in the school were the same ones that she had had. And the principal even was the same principal. It was really a connection of generations at that time. We lived about a block away from my grandparents. And then one time, it was in August of the year that I was going to turn 8. My dad decided it would be a good idea if we moved out into the country. So that's what we did. My mother cried and cried because she was 4 whole miles away from her mom. My father, who had changed schools a great deal while he was growing up, felt that it would be a good idea if I continued in school number 5 in Paterson, New Jersey. And so, by agreement, I went during the week to live with my grandparents and my 3 aunts who had never married. It was really quite interesting. I missed not being with my mother and father and sisters, but at the same time, I got to be the little princess, the spoiled one, the only child. And that had its really good things about it. And then later on, when I finished with that school, I went back home and stayed the whole week, all the time, with my parents and sisters, and I went to Hawthorne High School. And then World War II came along, and just before that, I had graduated from high school, and I had gotten a job in the Revenue Accounting Department of New Jersey Bell Telephone. And then soon after that, World War II came about. And all during the war, I used to think, what is it that I am doing for the war effort besides being a nice person writing letters to service people? And I thought, well, I'm helping to keep the economy going. And if the economy keeps going, well, sure enough, we are going to win the war. So I convinced myself that I was doing a pretty good job. One Christmas, all of a sudden, I received a Christmas card from the boy next door, Charles Naundorf. And all the Christmas card said was Charlie N. And I was so surprised to receive this. And we talked about it and buzzed about it. And I wrote back to him, because that's, after all, what we were supposed to be doing, writing to the boys in service. So we often laugh about the fact that Charlie lived next door to me and never really paid that close attention to me until he was 8,000 miles away in the South Pacific. And so when he finally came back from the Navy, we were married. And then we went away together to Maryville, Tennessee, where there is a small Presbyterian college called Maryville College. It was a very, very nice experience, but it was hard for me. I had never been far away from home, and I guess I went through a feeling of homesickness. And actually, through the years, each time that I've moved, I've had a hard time making the change. It became a little better and a little better as time went on. I went to school just the same as Charlie did, and then I became pregnant, so I went to the head of the English department and I said, Dr. Hunter, I'm going to have to drop out of college. And he could not understand that. He was a man well ahead of his time, because he said, you can continue in school, and your husband can take care of this child part of the time, and you can part of the time. And that would have worked nicely, except we were also running out of money for me to keep going. So I became a homemaker and a mother, and we moved by and by to Rochester, New York. We tried to get closer to northern New Jersey so that we could see our families more often, but that's sometimes what happens when fate, or whatever it is, the hand of God, who knows, takes us where we finally go. So my husband and I had 3 more daughters after that, no sons. I sometimes kid and say no boys allowed. That's because I had 2 sisters and no brothers. My mother had 4 sisters and no brothers, and it seemed like everywhere we went, it was girls, girls, women, women. But that was okay. I guess maybe I would have benefited from having a son, but I did not have one, and that was that. After a while, as our children grew and they began going on with their lives, I decided that I wanted to go back to college to complete the degree that had been interrupted 20 years before. And so I went to Empire State College. It was there that I got my BS degree in Communications and Human Relations. It was there that I learned things about myself, knew why some of the things had happened to me in the way that it had, and it enabled me to have a broader vision so that as I became older, I had many interests in which to be involved. Today, I am very involved in our church. I have many different interests that I do there. I do publicity. I've just arranged for a missionary to come. And so I keep really busy. In fact, sometimes I think it's too busy. But I guess life is never exactly the way we want it. I have a very long-suffering husband, and he is a person who has encouraged me to come around and talk with people. He is a genealogist, so he is very interested in family, as I am. And what I want to do is encourage all of you who are here today to think back to what your families are like, what brought you to the place that you are today. It is not that family in and of itself is perhaps always the important thing for some people who are unhappy with their situation. But what it is, it shows that there is a connectedness between generations and between people. And I would like you to think about that. Then, stepping back from that, let's all come together and interweave our generations into a real good American tapestry. Thank you.